Do you even have a degree? The question wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like it owned the air, and for a brief second, even the city outside the glass walls of the 42nd floor seemed to pause as every executive at the table turned toward the woman standing quietly beside the coffee cart. Emily Carter didn't flinch, didn't rush to answer, didn't lower her eyes the way people expected someone in her position to do. Instead, she simply looked at the screen across the room, where numbers flickered in confident rows. Projections climbing cleanly upward as if certainty itself had been coded into them. The kind of numbers that made investors nod and CEOs sign, without hesitation. Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, the faint reflection of Manhattan's skyline dancing across his polished watch. A man who had built a 9-figure empire by trusting his instincts and testing everyone around him, especially those who didn't belong in rooms like this. And right now, Emily clearly didn't belong. At least not on paper. She was supposed to be invisible. Just another server moving between tailored suits and quiet deals, refilling glasses, placing cups exactly where they were needed, unnoticed, unimportant. But she had made one mistake, or maybe one choice, because 10 seconds earlier, as she passed behind the last chair, she had paused, just slightly, just enough to notice something no one else had. A number that didn't align, a decimal that drifted too far from the model beneath it. Small, almost nothing, but not nothing. And she had said it, soft, almost to herself. That number doesn't match the risk model. And now the room was watching her like she had just stepped onto a stage she wasn't invited to. Daniel's lips curved into something between amusement and challenge. Unless you have a degree, he added, his voice calm, controlled, practiced. You might want to stick to serving coffee. A few quiet chuckles followed, the kind that didn't need permission. Emily let the silence sit, not defensive, not embarrassed, just still, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the cart, her eyes returning to the screen instead of the man who had just questioned her worth. Outside, a helicopter passed in the distance, its low hum barely audible through the glass. And inside, the numbers remained, unchanged, confident. Wrong. She stepped forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one step. Then another, until she stood close enough to the display for her shadow to touch it. It's off by 17.3%, she said, her voice even, almost quiet enough to miss if the room hadn't already gone completely still. One of the board members shifted in his chair, another leaned forward slightly, and Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Not anger, not yet, curiosity, maybe, or recognition of a game he hadn't expected to play today. Emily reached for a marker on the side of the screen, hesitated for less than a second, then began to write. Not fast, not slow, just precise. Numbers unfolding in clean, deliberate strokes, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. No hesitation, no correction, as if she had already run the entire calculation in her head before stepping forward. The room watched, not breathing, not interrupting, because something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, but changes everything anyway. And for the first time since the meeting began, Daniel Whitmore wasn't looking at a waitress. He was watching a variable he hadn't accounted for. The marker stopped moving, not because she hesitated, but because she had finished. Emily stepped back half an inch, just enough to let the board see the full equation. Numbers layered over the original projection like a quiet correction that refused to be ignored. No flourish. No explanation yet, just the results sitting there, undeniable. One of the senior analysts frowned, leaning closer as if proximity might change what he was seeing. Another reached for his tablet, fingers moving quickly, recalculating, checking, verifying. The soft tapping of glass filled the silence. And then it happened, not all at once, but in small, almost reluctant shifts. A chair creaked, someone exhaled, and the first voice broke through. That is not possible. But it was, and they knew it, because the numbers were lining up, each independent check landing on the same conclusion, the same quiet correction. Daniel remained still, his posture unchanged, but his gaze had locked onto the screen with a focus that stripped away the casual arrogance from moments before. He was not smiling now, not testing, not performing. He was thinking, fast, precise, the way he did when something mattered. Walk me through it, he said, not loud, not sharp, but different. The room noticed. Emily did not look surprised. She nodded once, stepping forward again. This time not as someone passing through, but as someone who understood exactly where she was standing. Your growth assumption is based on a 12-month rolling average, she began, her voice steady, each word placed carefully. But the last quarter included an outlier spike tied to a one-time contract in Texas. About $12.8 million. A few heads lifted. At that, recognition flickering across faces that had signed off on that very deal. When you normalize for that, she continued, already writing the adjusted figure. The baseline drops, which compounds across your 6-month forecast. She circled the new projection, not aggressively, just enough to guide the eye. 17.3%. The same number she had said before, now built, supported, undeniable. The analyst who had spoken earlier slowly lowered his tablet, his lips pressed together as if arguing with reality and losing. Someone else whispered, "We missed that." Not accusing, just stunned. Daniel stood up, not abruptly, but with intention, the kind of movement that made the room adjust around him without being told. He walked toward the screen, stopping just short of where Emily stood, close enough to see the details, not so close as to crowd her. His eyes traced the equation, line by line, not skipping, not assuming. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but it carried further. "If we sign this deal today," he said, more to the room than to her, "we are overvaluing the return by roughly $80 million within 6 months. No one argued, because no one could. The silence that followed was different now, not polite, not dismissive, but heavy with the weight of something that had almost gone unnoticed. Daniel turned his head slightly, just enough to look at Emily again. Really look this time, not at the uniform, not at the role, but at the precision, the control, the certainty she had brought into a room full of people who were supposed to have it. "What is your name?" he asked, and it was not a formality. Emily met his gaze, calm as before. "Emily Carter," she said, no title, no explanation, just the name. And for a moment, something flickered in Daniel's expression, not recognition fully formed, but the beginning of it. Like a memory trying to surface, something about the way she stood, the way she thought, the way she did not rush to fill silence. It was familiar, and he did not like not knowing why. He glanced briefly at the board, then back at her. The smallest shift in his posture signaling a change that everyone in the room could feel, but no one would name. "Take a seat," he said, not as a command, but as an invitation that did not expect to be refused, and this time, no one laughed. Emily did not move immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she understood what that invitation meant. It was not about a chair, not really. It was about crossing a line that had been very clearly drawn the moment she walked into the room with a coffee tray instead of a portfolio. Her eyes shifted briefly to the seat Daniel had indicated, then back to him, measuring, not the authority, but the intent behind it. The room waited again, not impatient, but curious in a way that felt different now, as if everyone had silently agreed that whatever she did next mattered more than anything on the agenda. Emily set the marker down carefully in its place, aligning it with the edge of the tray as if small details still mattered, because they did. Then she stepped around the chair and sat, not slowly, not dramatically, just naturally, as though she had always belonged at that table and had simply taken a different path to get there. A few board members exchanged glances, subtle, controlled, but impossible to hide completely. Daniel returned to his seat across from her, his movements precise, his expression composed. But the dynamic had shifted, and he knew it. Everyone did. He tapped once on the table, a quiet signal that pulled the room back into structure. "Let us continue," he said. But his eyes remained on Emily, not in challenge now, but in evaluation. "If the baseline is flawed, what would you adjust beyond the projection?" It was not a test anymore, not entirely. But it was still a question that carried weight. Emily folded her hands lightly on the table, not defensive, not eager, just ready. "The acquisition timeline," she replied, her voice calm. "You are assuming integration within 90 days, but based on the size of the Texas contract infrastructure, it will take closer to 150. She paused just enough for the number to settle, then continued. "Which delays revenue recognition and increases operational cost by approximately 12% in the first 2 quarters. One of the executives leaned back, exhaling slowly. Another began typing again, faster this time. Daniel's fingers rested against the table, unmoving, but his focus sharpened further. "And your source?" he asked, not dismissive, but direct. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "I worked on that contract," she said. Simple, factual, no embellishment. The words landed quietly, but their impact was immediate. Daniel's brow shifted slightly. Not confusion, not disbelief, but alignment, pieces beginning to connect. "Worked on it," he repeated, softer now, as if testing the memory against the present. Emily nodded once. "Risk analysis and integration modeling," she added, still not offering more than necessary, still letting the information stand on its own. The analyst to Daniel's left turned sharply. "That team was internal," he said, his tone edged with surprise. Emily glanced toward him briefly, then back to Daniel. "It was," she replied, and that was all. No explanation, no defense, just confirmation. The room absorbed it, the implications spreading in quiet waves. Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing not in skepticism, but in recognition finally taking shape. The name, the precision, the familiarity that had been just out of reach. It was not a coincidence. It was a memory he had chosen not to revisit until now. "Emily Carter," he said again, slower this time, as if placing the name into a space it had once occupied. "You submitted a report," he continued, more to himself than to her, flagging a long-term risk in that same contract. Emily did not smile, did not react outwardly. She simply held his gaze. "Yes," she said, and the single word carried more weight than any explanation could, because now the room was not just seeing her intelligence, they were beginning to see the history behind it. And Daniel understood something in that moment that no projection could quantify. The mistake was not in the numbers on the screen. It had happened long before that, when a voice like hers had been heard and then ignored. The room did not recover right away, not from the numbers, not from the correction, but from what came after, because data could be fixed, models could be rebuilt, but a missed voice had a different kind of weight, the kind that lingered. Daniel's gaze remained on Emily, not searching anymore, but remembering, the edges of that memory sharpening with every passing second. The report had been thorough, precise, inconvenient. It had challenged a timeline that everyone else had already agreed to. It had slowed momentum, and at the time, speed had been more valuable than caution, or at least that was the justification. He had not dismissed it personally, not directly, but he had allowed it to be dismissed, and that distinction felt thinner now than it ever had before. One of the board members cleared his throat, attempting to pull the room back into familiar territory. "We can revisit the integration schedule," he said, careful, measured. "Adjust the forecast accordingly." But his voice lacked the certainty it carried earlier. Another executive nodded. "We should delay the signing until we validate the revised model." The language shifted quickly, decisively, as if the room itself was correcting course. But beneath that shift, something quieter remained, an awareness that the correction had not come from within their ranks. Daniel finally leaned forward, his hands resting flat on the table. The movement subtle, but it anchored the room again. "Why were you not in that meeting?" he asked, his voice directed at Emily, but carrying across the entire table. It was not an accusation, not yet, but it was not casual either. Emily did not look surprised by the question. She had been expecting it, not because she had planned this moment, but because moments like this always followed truth. "I was not invited," she said, simple, direct, no resentment in her tone, just fact. A few eyes shifted, discomfort flickering across faces that had once controlled access to rooms like this. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not in anger toward her, but in recognition of a system he had benefited from and rarely questioned. And after the report, he continued, "What happened?" The question hung longer this time, heavier, because it reached beyond numbers into decisions. Emily's hands remained still on the table, her posture unchanged. "Nothing," she said, and that single word carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have, because it was not dramatic, not exaggerated, it was absence. The kind that spoke for itself. The analyst who had challenged her earlier looked down at his tablet, scrolling through archived documents, searching, verifying, and then he stopped, his expression tightening as he found what he was looking for. "The report is here," he said quietly, almost to himself, then louder. It was flagged, but marked as non-critical. A silence followed, not shocked this time, but reflective, the kind that forces people to reconsider not just what they missed, but why they missed it. Daniel exhaled slowly, not frustration, not relief, something in between. Non-critical, he repeated, the words sounding different now, stripped of their earlier convenience. He looked at Emily again, and for the first time, there was no distance in his gaze, no hierarchy, just acknowledgement. "And now you are serving coffee," he said, not as a judgment, but as a statement that carried its own question beneath it. Emily held his gaze steadily. "For now," she replied, and there was no bitterness in it, no attempt to prove anything, just a quiet certainty that did not depend on the room, did not depend on him. And that, more than the numbers, more than the correction, was what shifted something inside Daniel Whitmore, because he had spent years measuring value and projections and outcomes. But sitting across from her now, he realized there was another metric he had underestimated entirely, one that did not appear on any screen, one that did not ask for permission to exist, and it was already changing the direction of everything. In that room, no one reached for the coffee anymore, the tray beside the wall forgotten as the room recalibrated around a truth it could not ignore. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table, not out of impatience, but rhythm, a habit he had when decisions began forming faster than words. "We are not signing today," he said finally, his voice steady. Final, the kind that did not invite debate. A few heads nodded immediately. Others followed a second later, not out of agreement, but alignment, because when direction shifts at the top, the rest adjusts without friction. "I want a full revision," he continued, his eyes moving briefly to the screen, then back to Emily. "Not just the projection, the entire integration strategy." The analyst to his left straightened, already preparing to respond. "We can have an updated model by end of day," he offered, but Daniel shook his head. "Slightly, not fast," he said, calm but firm. "Right." The words settled differently. Heavier. The room understood. Speed had already cost them once. Emily remained still, her hands resting lightly, her posture unchanged. She was not leaning into the moment, not claiming space. She simply occupied it, and somehow that carried more presence than anything else in the room. Daniel studied her for a second longer before speaking again. "You said you worked on the risk analysis," he said. "How long ago?" Emily answered without pause. 18 months. Daniel nodded slowly, calculating, aligning timelines in his head. "And your conclusion then?" he pressed, not testing, but confirming. "The same," she replied, her voice even. "Delayed integration, inflated baseline, long-term loss. No emphasis, no need." The clarity was enough. One of the board members leaned forward, curiosity overtaking caution. "Then why stay silent until now?" he asked, not accusing, but genuinely trying to understand. Emily turned her gaze toward him briefly, then back to the table. "I was not silent," she said, and the distinction landed quietly. The man leaned back again, absorbing it. Daniel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not surprise, but recognition of the precision in her words. She did not frame herself as overlooked. She stated facts, and let others sit with the implication. "What happened after?" Daniel asked again, softer this time, not as a CEO, but as someone tracing a decision. "Backward." Emily exhaled once, not tired, not emotional, just measured. "The report was archived," she said. The team moved forward. She paused for half a second, then added, "I moved out." The phrasing was simple, but the meaning was not. A few glances crossed the table again, quieter now, more careful. Daniel's jaw set slightly, not in frustration, but in understanding of consequence. Decisions made in conference rooms did not end when meetings did. They carried forward, shaping paths, closing doors, sometimes without anyone noticing until much later. "And now," he said, his voice lower, more deliberate. "You are here." Emily nodded once. "Yes," she replied. And there was something in that yes, not resignation, not defiance, something steadier, something that did not depend on circumstance. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on her. The room waited, not because they needed instruction, but because something larger than the deal was unfolding, something none of them had planned for. You corrected an $80 million mistake, he said finally, not loudly, not for effect, just fact, from a position where you were not even supposed to speak. No one moved, no one interrupted, because they all understood what he was really saying, and more importantly, what he was not saying yet. Daniel's next words came slower, measured, as if each one had to be placed exactly right. That is not an accident. And for the first time since the meeting began, the power in the room did not come from the head of the table. It sat quietly across from him, hands folded, voice calm, waiting for nothing, needing nothing, and still changing everything. The words lingered longer than anyone expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they were precise, and precision had a way of stripping away excuses. Daniel did not look around the table this time. He did not need confirmation. He had already made the decision that mattered. But what came next was not as simple as numbers or projections. It was structural. It was human. And those were always more complicated. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped loosely now, no longer the rigid control from earlier, but something more intentional. Emily, he said, using her name without hesitation, without distance. If you had access to the full data today, not just what is on that screen, what would you change first? It was not a trick question, not a test disguised as curiosity. It was direct, and the room felt it, a shift from evaluation to engagement. Emily did not rush to answer, not because she did not know, but because she understood the weight of speaking into a room that had already proven it could ignore her once. She let a second pass, just enough for the silence to settle again. Then she spoke. The risk model itself, she said, her voice steady. Not just the inputs, the assumptions behind them. A few brows furrowed, one executive leaned in slightly. Be specific, he said, not dismissive, but focused. Emily nodded once. You are weighting short-term gains higher than long-term stability, she explained, because your model prioritizes rapid expansion metrics, but your current infrastructure cannot sustain that pace without increasing operational strain. She glanced briefly at the screen, then back to Daniel. You are not just overestimating growth. You are underestimating cost. The clarity in her words cut through the room more cleanly than any presentation slide could have. Daniel listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, absorbing not just what she was saying, but how she was saying it. No hesitation, no need to impress, just accuracy. And your adjustment? He asked, his tone quieter now, more deliberate. Emily folded her hands again, grounding herself not in the room, but in the logic. Rebalance the model to account for infrastructure scaling lag, she said. Extend the integration window to 150 days. Reduce projected returns by 15% in the first 2 quarters, and reallocate capital toward operational support instead of aggressive expansion. She paused briefly, then added, You lose speed, but you gain sustainability. The room did not react immediately, not because they disagreed, but because they were recalculating, mentally, structurally, everything she had just said. One of the board members slowly nodded, almost to himself. Another adjusted his notes, crossing out numbers that had seemed solid less than 10 minutes ago. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, not frustration, not relief, but recognition of something he valued deeply, clarity. You are describing a different company, he said, not as a challenge, but as an observation. Emily met his gaze evenly. No, she replied. The same company, just seen correctly. The distinction landed with quiet force, and for a moment, no one spoke. Because the implication was not about changing direction, it was about finally understanding it. Daniel's fingers tapped once more against the table, slower this time. Not a habit now, but a signal to himself. He had spent years building systems that rewarded confidence, speed, decisiveness. But sitting across from Emily Carter, he was being reminded that none of those mattered if the foundation beneath them was flawed. And more importantly, if the people who could see those flaws were not given a voice. He looked around the table briefly, not for approval, but for awareness, then back to her. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something it had not at the beginning of the meeting, not authority, not control, but respect. Then we rebuild it, he said. And this time, no one in the room questioned who would be part of that process. No one wrote anything down at first, not because they did not need to, but because they understood that something more important than notes was unfolding. The kind of moment that does not repeat itself the same way twice. Daniel remained still for a second longer after speaking, letting the weight of his own decision settle into the room. Then he turned slightly toward the rest of the board, his voice returning to structure, but not to its old tone. "We pause all external communication on this deal," he said, calm, controlled, but no longer rushed. "No announcements, no projections released, nothing leaves this room until the model is rebuilt." Heads nodded, this time without hesitation, not because they were told, but because the logic had already shifted. The old urgency no longer applied. One of the senior partners adjusted his glasses, leaning forward. "We will need a new lead on the revision," he said carefully, his eyes flicking briefly toward Emily before returning to Daniel, testing the implication without stating it. Daniel did not look away, did not soften the moment. "We already have one," he replied, and this time, the direction of the room aligned instantly. No confusion, no resistance, just a quiet acceptance of what had become obvious. Emily did not react outwardly, not surprised, not flattered, just still, as if she had expected nothing and therefore could not be unsettled by anything. Daniel turned back to her, his posture composed, but the distance between them now gone in a way that could not be reversed. "You will have full access to the data," he said. "Everything, including internal reports, prior models, and current projections." He paused briefly, then added, "No filters." The phrase landed deliberately, a quiet acknowledgement of what had gone wrong before. Emily nodded once. "Understood," she said, her voice steady, neither accepting nor rejecting the weight of the offer, simply recognizing it. One of the analysts spoke up, more cautiously this time. "We can assemble a support team," he offered. "Coordinate across departments." Emily glanced toward him briefly, then back to Daniel. "I will need people who question assumptions, not just follow them," she said, not dismissing the offer, but refining it. The analyst hesitated, then nodded, understanding the difference. Daniel allowed the exchange to unfold without interruption, watching, listening, recalibrating in real time. This was not how meetings usually went, not how authority was usually redistributed. But nothing about this situation was usual anymore. "You will have that," he said. Finally, his tone firm. Not as a promise, but as a decision already made. A quiet energy moved through the room. Not tension, not uncertainty. Something sharper, something closer to clarity. People began shifting, not in discomfort, but in readiness. Laptops opened, notes reorganized. Not because they were told to act, but because they understood that action was already required. Emily rose from her seat, not abruptly, not ceremonially, just naturally, as if the transition from observer to participant had already been completed the moment she spoke earlier. She glanced once at the screen, where the corrected numbers still remained, then back at Daniel. "I will need access to the original risk files from 18 months ago," she said, precise. Already moving forward. Daniel nodded. "You will have them within the hour," he replied. No delay, no negotiation, just alignment. Emily reached for the marker again, not to prove anything, but to begin, and in that small, almost ordinary movement, the room understood. Something that had not been written on any slide. Leadership had not been reassigned by title, but by clarity, and once that shift happens, it does not ask permission to stay. The room no longer felt like a boardroom, not in the way it had at the beginning of the meeting. The polished table, the skyline, the tailored suits were all still there, but the center of gravity had shifted, and everyone could feel it without needing to name it. Emily stood near the screen, not presenting, not performing, just working. Her focus steady as she rewrote sections of the model with the same quiet precision she had shown from the start. Numbers changed, assumptions adjusted, timelines extended, each correction small on its own, but together forming something entirely different, something more grounded, more real. Around the table, conversations had begun again, but they were different now. Lower, more careful, less about defending past decisions and more about understanding the ones ahead. One executive leaned toward another. "If we adjust the integration window, we will need to renegotiate vendor timelines," he whispered. The other nodded, already considering the ripple effect. Daniel remained seated, watching, not directing, not interrupting, just observing the way the room responded when clarity replaced assumption. It was not chaos. It was alignment, slower, but stronger. His eyes moved from the screen to Emily, studying not just what she was doing, but how she carried herself while doing it. No urgency, no need for recognition, just accuracy. It was a kind of confidence he recognized, but rarely saw at this level of restraint. One of the younger analysts approached cautiously, stopping a few feet from her. "Do you want me to pull the historical cost data from the last 2 quarters?" he asked, his tone respectful, not out of hierarchy, but because the room had already decided who was leading this process. Emily nodded once without looking away from the model. "Yes, but include variance reports, not just summaries," she replied, and the analyst left immediately. No hesitation, no clarification needed. Daniel noticed that the efficiency, the clarity of instruction, the absence of wasted movement. It was the kind of operational flow companies tried to design, and yet here it was, forming naturally around one person who had not even been in the room an hour ago. He stood slowly, walking toward the screen again, not to take control, but to understand the structure she was building. He stopped beside her, not too close, not imposing, just present. "What changes if we push the capital allocation into operational support as you suggested?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost conversational. Emily adjusted one of the figures, then answered, "Short-term margins tighten," she said, "but failure risk drops significantly." She turned slightly toward him, just enough to meet his eyes. "You trade visibility for stability." The phrasing was simple, but the meaning was not. Daniel nodded once, absorbing it. Behind them, the board continued to shift, recalibrate, adapt, not because they were told to, but because the logic demanded it. The old model no longer held, and everyone knew it. One of the senior partners spoke up from the table. "We will need to inform investors," he said, cautious but clear. Daniel turned slightly, his expression composed. "We will," he replied, "when we have something accurate to tell them. No defensiveness, no urgency, just a different standard." The partner nodded, accepting it without argument. Emily stepped back half a step, reviewing the updated structure on the screen, not satisfied yet. But closer, the numbers now told a different story, not as impressive, not as aggressive, but honest. And in that honesty, there was something stronger than projection. Daniel looked at the screen, then at her, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his gaze, no test, no measure, just recognition, not of what she had done, but of what he had almost lost by not listening the first time. And in a room built on decisions, that realization carried more weight than any number they had corrected that day. The final numbers settled into place without announcement, no applause, no visible relief, just a quiet understanding that what they were looking at now was real, not perfect, not impressive in the way the original projection had been, but grounded, stable, something that could hold under pressure instead of collapsing beneath it. Emily stepped back from the screen, not claiming the result, not presenting it, simply allowing it to exist. The room remained still for a moment longer, as if adjusting to a version of success that did not rely on exaggeration. Daniel stood beside her, his eyes tracing the updated Model 1 last time, not searching for flaws, but confirming the absence of illusion. He nodded once, almost to himself, then turned toward the table. "This is the version we move forward with," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made the decision final. No one argued. No one suggested alternatives, because there were none left that could match what had just been built. The senior partner who had questioned earlier closed his notebook slowly, not in defeat, but in acceptance. "We will inform the investors by tomorrow morning," he said, more certain now, the uncertainty replaced by clarity. Daniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it. Then his attention returned to Emily, not as a leader evaluating a subordinate, but as someone recognizing an equal in a space that had not been designed to see her that way. "You should not have been outside this room," he said, not as a compliment, not as a correction, but as a fact that had finally been acknowledged. Emily met his gaze, steady as always. "I was not outside," she replied, her voice quiet. "I was just not heard." The distinction landed with more force than anything said before, because it did not accuse, it revealed. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded, once, fully this time, as if accepting not just her words, but the responsibility behind them, around them. The board began to move again, chairs shifting, conversations resuming, but nothing returned to how it had been. Something fundamental had changed, not in the structure of the company, but in the way it would see itself moving forward. Emily reached for the coffee tray, not out of obligation, but instinct, a habit from a role she had carried longer than this moment. Daniel noticed it immediately. "Leave it," he said, not sharply, not as an order, but as a quiet interruption to something that no longer fit. Emily paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the tray. Then she let it go, not hesitantly, not dramatically, just simply, as if setting down something that had already lost its weight. Daniel extended his hand toward her, not for ceremony, not for display, just acknowledgement. "We rebuild from here," he said, and the words carried no trace of the arrogance that had started the meeting, only clarity. Emily looked at his hand for a brief moment, then took it, her grip firm, steady, not deferential, not challenging, just equal. And in that small, quiet exchange, the room understood something no presentation could teach. Power does not always shift with noise or force. Sometimes it changes in silence. In a single moment, when someone chooses to listen, and someone else no longer needs to prove that they were worth hearing.